بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم نحمده ونصلي على رسوله الكريم أما بعد أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. Now, as I promised in last week's lesson, that in this week's lesson we are going to be looking at the next part of the janazah, and that is with regards to the shrouding of the deceased. So in last week's lesson we were looking at the presentation with regards to bathing the deceased. So in this particular week's lesson, we'll be looking at the rulings and the practical method of shrouding the deceased, okay? Now, what we will firstly do is that firstly, I'll give you a practical example of how to shroud the deceased. And then afterwards, I'll probably request some brothers to actually then come up and then show the rest of the class how to actually do it. And then afterwards, we'll just quickly go over the notes which is in front of us. This brother, what's the brother?
Safi.
Safi. Okay, mashallah. So Safi, he's volunteered to be the corpse today. So if you want to lie down.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. So if you just, yeah, that's fine. You could do it that way. Okay. Okay. Now, yeah, just lie down. Okay. All right. Now.
There's no difference between a boy and a man in terms of.
Oh, no, a boy and man. No, there's no difference boy and man. Yeah, there's a difference between men and women. Yeah. We'll look at that later.
Yeah.
Okay, now there are three. Now, when it comes for the coffin of a boy or a man, there are three types of clothing which we use. There are three kapras. There are three items or types of clothing which we use. Now, the first one, which is right at the bottom here, we call that lifafa. So lifafa is the cloth which you put right at the bottom of the stand or at the bottom of the table. These words are coming up later. The second kapra or the second item of clothing or cloth which I put on top of the lifafa is called in Arabic the izar. Okay, izar. And the third type of clothing is called qamis. So three Arabic words here. The one at the bottom is called lifafa. Number two is called the izar. And the third on top of that is called the qamis. Now, if you cast your mind back to last week's lesson, and when we were doing the bathing and so on, and we had Anik as an example. So now, when you finish the bathing and the ghusl, I think the last thing I mentioned is that, do you know that kapra or that towel which you use to cover his private parts? So remember, that's wet because you've obviously bathed him. So what you do is that you then wipe him, and that wet towel, you remove it, and then you put a clean one on top. So just imagine that the deceased or the corpse is on this particular stand here. So you've done his ghusl, he's now dry, and you've got a piece of towel over his private parts covering his navel and his private part area. Now what then normally happens is, just imagine this is the table where they've done the ghusl. They then get the coffin. Okay, they then get the coffin right next to the table. That's what they normally do in practice. Generally speaking, what you should do is you should actually lift the body, then take it to another table like here. But what they normally do is that they just get the coffin right next to the bathing table, and inside the coffin they will have these three clothings, yeah? These three kapras with the lifafa right at the bottom, izar on top, and then the qamis. Okay, so that's what they normally do nowadays. But the sunnah method is that you should actually have them separately and then afterwards put him into the coffin. Okay, but obviously because of lack of space, other issues, probably lack of time, wallahu alam. So what they do is that they have it already set in the coffin. Okay. Now before you place the deceased or the mayyit on top of the clothing, it is sunnah that, you know, these three clothing which you have, you should put some attar or fragrance over it. Okay, so what you should do, get some attar, just rub it on the kafan, you know, all over the kafan. Sometimes what they do is that if they have it on a separate table, next to it they light a agarbatti, so they let the fragrance come into the kapra and so on. So what you should do is that fragrance, you put some attar, put some nice perfume there onto the kafan. Okay. Now let's go back to the main part, obviously how to do the kafan. So just say, for example, you've got the deceased, the corpse. So you lift him, you pick him up, and then you place him on top here. Okay, you place him on top. Now the first cloth which you use is called the kameez. Now obviously we didn't actually have, obviously we weren't allowed to cut this, but what you should have done with this is, do you have a thingy? Do you have a marker? Is there a marker there? There's no marker? Yeah. Any markers or?
I'll be the one in the... Just check the middle
How long
question.
is the cloth going to be?
There is...
Is it all of one size? All three?
No, the lifafa, no, the bottom of the lifafa, that's a bit longer. I'm not sure exact thingy, but what they do is they just go according to his height. So what they do is that just make it a bit more bigger, a bit more longer, the lifafa. The izar, which is the second one, that tends to be according to his
So say his
height.
size, his size, how long will it be?
Just say like, I don't know, just say 5-10 centimeters on either side, that's it. Okay. Yeah, just have a look. Okay, now the first clothing which I was saying, where the deceased is on, is called the kameez. Now, what happens in the kameez is that you fold the kameez, you fold that particular clothing, and you do a V-neck, like a V-neck cut on that particular clothing, okay? So just say, for example, if we were to assume this was the kameez, yeah, this one here. Obviously, before we put him there, we will actually do a V-cut. So what would happen is that we place the deceased, and then, you know, that kapra, we just fold it, and you know that V-neck, don't suffocate. So in that V-neck here, that V-neck cut, you then place his head through that cut. So then obviously his head will then come out, and then that kapra will then go like this, okay? What I'll do, just keep it like this, okay? Is that okay? Understood that. So what you do, that is the kameez. So you do a V-neck cut. So you then place the deceased on the clothing, and then what you do is like a flap here. So you then put the flap, put his head through the flap which has been cut through that, and then place the remaining part of the cloth over his private parts. Okay. Now, when you are doing that, then you know that towel which you were using to cover his private part, you just like slide it from the bottom as well. Okay. So then obviously his private parts, all that area is covered as well. You understood that? Yeah. Okay. So that's the first part. Okay. Of doing the kafan, you do his kameez. Thereafter, the next part you do is you then fold what we call the izar. Now, izar, as was explained to the brother, it will be the size of the cloth will be according to the guy's height. Okay, obviously the cloth which we have is not exactly according to the person's height. Okay, now what you do is that when it comes to the izar, you firstly wrap his left hand side. Okay, this is where a lot of people unfortunately get mixed up. You do his left hand side. A lot of people think, oh no, it's sunnah to do the right. It's sunnah to have the right on top of the left. So you do the left hand side first. Okay, so you cover the left hand side, and then you do the right hand. Then you put the right flap over the left.
Okay. Still the first one, yeah.
No, that's the second one, the izar. And then the last one, the lifafa, which you're talking about, which tends to be a bit more bigger. Then that will be used to then cover the last part, i.e., you do the left hand side of the of the deceased, and then the right hand flap. So remember, the right flap should be on top of the left one. Okay, so that will then mean that you need to cover the left flap first, and then the right on top. Okay. Any questions or?
The V-cut is only on the first one.
Yeah, on the first one, the kameez.
So you just fold it in, Sheikh, do you? How
Yeah.
do you just fold it in like this?
Yeah. So do you know his head? You just put it through that hole, and then you just like cover it like that.
So that piece will have to be quite long though, isn't it?
Yeah.
The top, because it's
The
gonna
kameez will be like, say, more or less same as the lifafa.
to cover down to is basically below
Yeah.
his satar, which will be
Yeah, it'll be quite long. Yeah, it
Be
will be
quite
quite
long.
long. Yeah.
okay.
So the width-wise, how? When you fold it, you explain the fold it in.
Yeah, you put the left one first, and then the right one on top. Does that make sense?
Cover the
Would have to cover the body.
Yeah, you'll have to cover the body. Okay, and then after you've done that, I haven't mentioned it here, but after you've done that, it's not a requirement when you are burying him in a coffin But if you are, say, for example, in Bangladesh or the places where they actually bury without a coffin, what you should then do is get 3 strings, or 3 ribbons, 1 ribbon around his head side, 1 in the middle, and 1 on the leg side. And the reason why is because remember, when all this covered, if you don't tie a ribbon, there's a danger that when you are then carrying him, because remember this is only when he's not in the coffin, so there's a danger that the coffin may open up. So therefore, it's good practice that you then tie a ribbon around his leg side, in the middle, and also on the head side to cover that particular area. Okay. Any questions or okay? If it's in the coffin, there's no need, because when in the coffin, because that space is compact as it is, so there's no need for you to tie a ribbon. So because there's no danger of you opening it, because the guy's going to be in the coffin, so there's no danger of the coffin opening. So if it's in a coffin, there's no need for you to tie any ribbons or string. But obviously, if he's not in the coffin, then it's good practice that you tie something on his leg side, head side, and in the middle to stop the coffin from opening.
Yeah, but sometimes, like I send it to Bangladesh, it's wiser to ribbon it first.
Yeah, because then they take him out of the coffin.
They take it out of it. So it's better to
Yeah, better, yeah.
So another the committee where you cut the V shape and you put the head through. How far down does the kameez have to come? Is it below the?
Yeah, below, like it's covering the knees. Yeah.
Covering
So it has to be, as Brother Saif was saying, it has to be quite long.
Quite long.
42, because you remember the flap then has to cover all the way up to his knees, so it'll be quite long.
And the other way, that first piece will still be underneath,
Yeah.
right the way to.
Yeah, right the way up to including his thingy.
And the other 2 will cover the face as well.
Yeah, the other 2, yeah.
The other 2.
Yeah, the izar and the lifaf, and then they cover the face.
And the last piece is the left side first.
Okay, inshallah. What we'll do now, we'll just go over the material which is in front of us, then inshallah any of the questions I'll take regarding it. Okay, now the first section which we're going to look at with regards to the coffin is just firstly some introduction about how the coffin should be, how many pieces of clothing should there be, and so on and so forth. Now the first ruling here is that it is farz kifaya, like a communal obligation, that you at least use 1 piece of clothing for the mayyit and for the deceased. And what I mentioned, the 3 items of clothing, that is the sunnah. And generally speaking, we will use 3 items of clothing. But the very least, what we mean by the very least, like when in a situation of poverty where there's no one else there, it then becomes a communal obligation that you have to, the entire community, have to provide at least 1 piece of clothing for the deceased. So just say, for example, there's a situation, say in poor countries like Bangladesh, where a poor person has passed away and he's got no money for his coffin, he's got no money to buy any cloth to shroud him. In that situation, it becomes a communal obligation, i.e. everyone in that community, that they have to chip in to buy at least 1 piece of clothing, okay? So that's what it means by here. Even if just 1 piece of cloth is a collective obligation for the Muslims. Obviously, sunnah, you should try to get 3 for that poor person. But just say, for example, you can't get 3, then the very least, the community, every single member of the community, what they have to do, they have to chip in and raise the money for at least 1 piece of cloth. If they don't, then, as I mentioned before, every single member, every single individual of the community would be considered sinful and gunagar. Okay? Then there's a story about Musab bin Umair radiallahu anhu and so on, when he was martyred, a very famous story, which is Fazail Amal and other books, okay? Then afterwards, the second ruling here is that it is sunnah to use 3 pieces for men and 5 for women. So when it comes to the coffin for men, use 3 pieces. So we mentioned the lifafa, izar on top, and then the kameez. And when it comes for women, you should use 5 pieces. Now what are the 2 extra ones for women? I'll just write it here. Number 4, the 4th one is, in Arabic, is called sinaband. That's how you spell it in English. Sinaband. And the 5th clothing, which you use for the woman, is a headscarf. Okay, headscarf. Okay, so the women, when you bury women, so whether it's girls or mature women, there's 5 clothings you need for them. The three are the lifafa, izar, and the qamis, and then two additional clothing, which the first one is called the sinaban, and number two is the headscarf. Now, what is the sinaban? Sinaban is another additional clothing. So it's again an area. It's like another additional clothing, which covers the woman's like chest area, like her breast area, and so on. So it's basically that. It has to be that long, where basically from her neck, say, up to her knees, that area is covered. So it's like an additional piece of clothing. Because obviously, if you're just going to use three clothing for women, there's a danger that, you know, their breasts may like stick out when you like shrouding them. So therefore, the Sharia has said that it's more parda for them, more kind of like seclusion for them, that when you bury or when you shroud a woman, that you add another additional clothing, and that clothing will be placed around the chest area to cover their breasts and their chest area. Okay, so that is called the sinaban. And then the fifth clothing which they will wear will be the headscarf. Okay, so then there'll be another additional, like a woman wears as a headscarf. So it'll be again white colored headscarf which they would use to cover their hair. Okay. Regarding the sinaban, this fourth clothing, you can put it either in between the lifafa and the izar. Okay, so you can put it in between the lifafa or the izar, or you can put it in between the qamis and the izar. So then that extra cloth here, you could actually put it. Remember, lifafa always has to be at the bottom, because that's the final clothing, or the cloth which we're going to use to cover the deceased. So the sinaban, it can be in between the lifafa and the izar, or it can be in between the qamis and the izar. Okay, so that additional clothing. The headscarf, that's like separate from the actual. Obviously, you put the headscarf, but remember the headscarf has to be underneath the lifafa. You can't, like, for example, cover the woman and then just like have a headscarf on her head. No, that's going to be wrong. So you'll cover her hair with the headscarf, and then at the end you'll just do the lifafa over her. Okay. Any questions on this one, or? Okay, everyone understood that, yeah? Where to put the sinaban?
The sinaban is the same length.
Yeah, it's same length, just like covering, say, from the neck up to her shins area. That's what it's just like basically another additional clothing. Yeah, again, both sides. It has to be like both sides, covering the front and the back. But it's just like additional clothing, just to like cover her more, if that makes sense. To cover.
The lengthwise will be just that.
Yeah, it'll be just, yeah, according to her. Okay.
And the headscarf, would it be like just
normal heads, no, like, yeah, sufficient to cover hair? That'll be okay.
That's placed at the end.
No, yeah, that'll be placed at the end, but it has to be underneath the lifafa. Does that make sense?
Underneath.
Yeah. Basically, what you'll do is that after you put the qamis on, you'll just put the headscarf there and there. Make sure you just like it's covering your head. That's what it is. But it can't be something like you cover her entirely and then you place the headscarf on top of that. It has to be covering her hair. Okay. Okay. Rule number 3 is a shroud should be white. Okay. So another sunnah. Again, this is like a sunnah. You don't have to, but the kafan has to be white. Obviously, in certain situations where I know you can't actually afford, sometimes poor people, they can't afford anything. So if they have, say, like, brown colored or, green colored kafan or towels or something to do their kafan, that's okay. But generally speaking, when somebody can afford it, it's a sunnah that you use white for the kafan and for the shrouding. Number 4, it's also mentioned that the shroud should be scented and perfumed. Okay. So the shroud, as I was explaining right at the beginning of the lesson, that before you place the deceased or the mayyit on the table or inside the coffin where the shroud or the kafan is, so then the kafan you should like perfume it and scent it from before. Also, number 5, to use silk cloth for men is also impermissible. Okay, so men are not allowed to use silk. Generally speaking, as you know, that men, it's impermissible for them to use silk. So to shroud men with silk clothing, that is also impermissible as well. And at the bottom, I've also mentioned that even though for women it is considered lawful and permissible to wear silk, it is considered to be, I should say, a form of extravagance to shroud the woman with silk clothing. Okay, so even the woman as well in that situation should avoid using silk for her. Okay. Any other questions or no? Okay, and then on the next page I just explained it, the kafan for a man or a male child. So what you use, so it says one large sheet, lifafa, approximately 1 arm longer than the height of the deceased in which he can be wrapped. Okay, so around 1 arm's length longer than his head and his feet, so that he could easily be wrapped with it. Number 2, the trouser izar, which is like a smaller sheet, which is from his head to the feet. And the third item of clothing is called the qamis, which is a sheet from the neck to his feet. Okay, so as I was explaining before, like the third kapra here, that is called the qamis. So in terms of the actual length of the qamis, that will be similar to the lifafa, because remember, you know, this qamis, you're going to be wrapping it onto, you're going to be folding it into 2 to then make the V cut and so on. So it'll be quite long, so you could have the deceased head going through the cut. And then you've got the izar on top. So the izar, in terms of the length of the izar, should be the same as from the person's head up to his feet. And the lifafa finally should be a bit more longer than that, so that you can then fully wrap the deceased and the mayyit inside, okay? So I've already explained that. And then the next section just explains how to put the kafan on and so on, okay? So we've already looked at that before. Okay, straightforward. And then the next page. Sorry.
The next second clothes will go up to his head. So when you come to wrap it, you wrap it with the third clothes.
Yeah, the lifafa, yeah.
And what do you do? How do you place the second cloth?
Yeah, you know, you'll cover his
face.
You'll cover his face with the second, yeah.
Then wrap it with.
Yeah, wrap it, yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, some other miscellaneous ruling here. Number 1, just I've posed a question there, shrouding the deceased with the turban. Like when you bury the deceased, does he or can, just an example, we mentioned for a woman you put a headscarf on, but just say for a man, would you, or are you allowed to put a turban? You know, there could be a person like, say, a scholar who's had a habit of always wearing a turban. So when he passes away, do you put a turban around his head? So the answer in short is that in the Hanafi fiqh, it's not permissible. Other schools of thought, like Imam Malik rahimullah, he says here that when you bury the deceased, then you should put a turban on his head as well and bury him in that way. But Imam Hanifa rahimullah says that no, you should just leave it as it is. So obviously the way I explained it, with the 3 clothing, lifafa, izar, qamis, that's what you'll use to shroud the deceased. The next ruling, rule number 2, is if a muhrim, i.e. someone in the state of Hajj, or when he was a pilgrim, if he passed away, then does he remain in the state of ihram or not? Now there's actually difference of opinions. Imam Malik and Imam Abu Hanif rahimullah, he says that when the muhrim, the person who's gone for Hajj, so he's in his ihram, and just say for example before, because remember when you're in ihram, just say you've gone for umrah, you are released from your ihram, you know, the 2 white clothing you're wearing, you're released from it if number 1, you perform the tawaf, and then number 2, you do the sa'i from Safa Marwa, and then you shave your head. That's when you are released from your ihram. So just say this individual here, he was making his way towards tawaf, and just say he was involved in an accident and he passed away. So according to Imam Hanifa, Imam Malik, they say that this person's ihram is now finished, is terminated. Which in other words, what I'm trying to say is that you'll then bathe him with all the fragrance which we mentioned in last week's lesson. You'll scent his clothing. All these things will be lawful and halal. The other imams like Imam Ahmad and Imam Shafi, they say that when a muhrim passes away, he's still in the state of ihram. Okay, now the reason why that's so important, because as you know that somebody who's in the state of ihram, he's not allowed to apply any perfume. You can't put any fragrance on his clothing You can't wash him with soap or anything like that. So according to Imam Ahmad, Imam Shafi, what they say is that muhrim who's passed away, because they say that his ihram is not terminated, so when you bathe him, you have to just bathe him with normal water. You can't use any kind of camphor water, as we looked at in last week's lesson. You can't wash him with soap or any other kind of fragrance. Just use normal water. And then when you are shrouding him, you can't put any attar or any kind of fragrance. When you are burying him, or even when you are bathing him, or when you are shrouding him, you can't have any agarbatti, say, lit in the background. So why? Because so that the fragrance doesn't come onto his clothing. Okay, so that's what the other imams say. However, according to Imam Hanifa, Imam Malik, they say that if somebody passes away in the state of ihram, his ihram is terminated. So therefore, you just treat him like a normal person, in terms of you're allowed to bathe him with soap, and all these things would be permissible and allowed. Okay. Any questions or?
So what happens if you die in Saudi Arabia and then they are not Hanafi people?
No. What will happen in that situation? If you are by yourself and just say, then in that situation, obviously you're not responsible for what they do. Obviously, if there were family there, they'll probably help you in terms of the bathing, so they'll probably know how to do it. If they don't know and they do it, then it's okay, because you're not responsible for that. And plus, it's one of those rulings where difference of opinion. So even if they did bury you according to the way they teach or the way they preach, then there's nothing wrong with it. Okay. Rule number 3 just says that a shroud should be nice but not so extravagantly expensive that it would unduly burden a person. Basically, it shouldn't be too expensive, too fancy and so on. Okay, something like decent, something which is reasonable, but it should not be like something which is very, very expensive and so on. And the last ruling, rule number 4, talks about, the shrouding money or the kafan, what we call in Arabic tajheez and takfeen. Who will pay for that? Now remember, when somebody passes away, it's from his property, it's from his estate. His burial costs will go from his property and his estate. So just say, for example, if somebody passed away and he left behind £10,000. Now, just say, for example, now this costs around 3,000 to, if you include the land, buying the land, say in Handsworth, and the coffin and, the bathing, everything. Just say it costs £3,000. Now, that £3,000? It will be taken from his own property. Okay, you don't go around with buckets or doing chanda for 3,000. It's from his own estate. It's from his own money. The £3,000 will be taken, and then whatever is left over, like 7,000 left over, then that will then be distributed amongst the inheritors and his close relatives. Okay, so just keep that in mind, because some people think that when somebody passes away, it's the family's responsibility, so the son's responsibility or the wife's responsibility. If a wife passes away, it's the husband's responsibility from his own pocket to pay for her or his burial and funeral costs. No, it's actually from their own property. You take the money. They spend, and then obviously you do the burial, and then whatever is left over, then that is then distributed amongst the inheritors. Okay, so just keep that in mind, because what normally happens is that somebody passes away, they save his money. So just say he had like 100,000 in his bank, whatever. They save his money. They don't use his money for his burial. It's like the son or the daughters or the uncles or the cousins. They chip in for his burial, for his shrouding, for his janazah, everything, for the buying of the land to bury him and so on. If they're taking him to Bangladesh, then the expenses for that. And then they don't touch anything from his property. So the Sharia says that no, when somebody passes away, at the end of the day, it's still his money. So he's more worthy that he uses that money on him, even though he's dead. But obviously the relatives who are alive, they should use his money for him. So you'll use his money for his burial, for his shrouding, for the janazah costs, for the taking the body from one place to another. And then obviously whatever is left over, then the inheritance will work on that. Okay? Yeah.
So suppose he's got no cash, but he's got property. He has to sell it first to get the money. So
no, because obviously that's going to take too long. So what could happen in that situation is that the son or the close relatives, they could pay from their own pocket and then later on take it out from his estate. Because obviously by him selling, it's going to take too long in that situation. So obviously, as we're going to look at later, the sunnah is you should try to bury the individual as soon as possible.
Is it encouraged for a person to save that money for that occasion, when they pass away? Should they have that?
Yes, you could say in a way it's encouraged. Yeah. Well, you should have at least that much saving where you could actually do your
So people who are part of the burial societies and all that. How does that? Is that okay?
Burial society. What does that mean?
The group of people will contribute £50, £100 a month.
Okay.
If someone passes away within the group, or they pay for the burial. Is that okay? It's set up for that purpose. So
there's nothing wrong with that. In principle, there's nothing wrong with that. That is okay because it's a way of helping. So it's not like, say, for example, interest or gambling. There's no aspect of that involved. So it's a way of helping each other. So there's nothing wrong with it.
So
That'll be permissible.
They could use the money, even though they might not have.
I think what happens, I think what I'm trying to say, they chip in probably £10-20 a month or whatever. Then there's a large pool of money. Yeah. So whoever passes away, then they use, and then they keep on doing it until the next person, and it just keeps on going. There's no, it's just like a way of helping someone. So that's okay. That's allowed. Okay. Any questions or? No. Okay.